They conducted experiments that defied every principle of medicine. They turned operating rooms into torture chambers. Yet, when the war ended, some faced the gallows while others lived quietly in respected positions, their pasts carefully concealed. The Nazi doctors who carried out unspeakable crimes against humanity met wildly different fates after 1945. Some were hunted, some were hired, and some simply vanished into new lives under different names. Before we go deeper into how these men escaped justice or faced its full weight, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The scope of Nazi medical crime stretched across a network of concentration camps from 1942 to 1945. More than 15,000 documented victims endured what Nazi physicians called research. At Dachau, prisoners were submerged in freezing water until they lost consciousness, part of hypothermia experiments ostensibly designed to help Luftwaffe pilots downed in the North Sea. At Auschwitz, Josef Mengele selected twins from arriving trains, subjecting them to comparative experiments that served no scientific purpose beyond satisfying his obsession with genetics. At Ravensbrück, doctors deliberately infected women with gangrene, tetanus, and other pathogens, then amputated limbs to test sulfa drugs. The experiments had clinical names, but no clinical value. They were torture dressed in white coats. These were not rogue actors operating in secret. The medical experiments were organized, documented, and approved by Nazi leadership. Karl Brandt, Adolf Hitler's personal physician, coordinated much of the program from his position as Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation. The doctors who participated held university degrees. They had taken the Hippocratic Oath. Many had published papers in medical journals before the war. They were respected members of the German medical establishment, working within a system that had redefined medicine as a tool of racial ideology. Under Nazi doctrine, certain lives were labeled unworthy of life. The physicians who accepted this premise stopped seeing their victims as patients and began treating them as experimental material. When Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in 1945, they found the evidence. Medical records detailed experiments with meticulous precision, noting temperatures, dosages, and survival times. Survivors bore the physical scars of surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. The liberators also found the bodies stacked in rooms adjacent to makeshift laboratories. The scale of the crimes left Allied commanders searching for precedents. War crimes tribunals had dealt with soldiers who violated the laws of war. But what legal framework could address physicians who had weaponized medicine itself? The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg tried the Nazi regime's highest leadership in 1945 and 1946. But the architects of the medical experiments required a separate reckoning. On December 9, 1946, an American military tribunal opened proceedings against 23 defendants in what would become known as the doctor's trial. 20 were physicians, 3 were administrators. The lead defendant, Karl Brandt, sat in the dock as both Hitler's doctor and the man who had overseen the euthanasia program that murdered more than 70,000 disabled Germans before the Holocaust began. The indictment charged the defendants with war crimes and crimes against humanity. The specific counts included medical experiments without consent, murder masquerading as euthanasia, and participation in the final solution through medical means. The trial lasted 140 days. Prosecutors introduced nearly 1,500 documents. 85 witnesses testified, including survivors who described the experiments in clinical detail that haunted the courtroom. One witness, Jadwiga Dzido, had been a Polish resistance fighter when she was imprisoned at Ravensbrück. Nazi doctors had deliberately infected her leg with bacteria and glass fragments, then denied treatment to observe the progression of gangrene. She rolled up her pant leg to show the judges her scarred limb. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet the defense attorneys argued that the doctors had been following orders, that wartime necessity justified extreme measures, and that no international law prohibited medical experiments at the time. On August 20, 1947, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 7 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Karl Brandt was among them, along with Waldemar Hoven, who had murdered prisoners at Buchenwald with phenol injections, and Joachim Mrugowski, who had supervised experiments with epidemic typhus. 5 defendants received life imprisonment. 4 drew prison terms between 10 and 20 years. 7 were acquitted outright. The death sentences were carried out on June 2, 1948, at Landsberg Prison. Brandt's last words were a defiant assertion that his actions had been necessary. He walked to the gallows without remorse. But 23 defendants represented only a fraction of the physicians and scientists who had participated in Nazi medical crimes. The doctors' trial targeted the most prominent figures, those whose roles could be proven through documentation captured by Allied forces. Hundreds of other doctors who had worked in concentration camps, conducted experiments, or participated in the euthanasia program were never charged. Some had died during the war. Some had destroyed evidence of their involvement. Many simply blended back into civilian life as the chaos of occupied Germany provided cover. In the immediate post-war years, the Allied occupation authorities faced a practical problem. Germany's medical infrastructure had been devastated. Hospitals needed staff. Public health crises demanded immediate attention. Typhus outbreaks, malnutrition, and overcrowded refugee camps created urgent medical needs that outweighed concerns about individual doctors' wartime activities. Occupation officials conducted denazification hearings, but the process was overwhelmed by volume and complexity. Medical licenses were often restored after perfunctory reviews. Doctors who claimed they had been coerced into Nazi Party membership or had played only minor roles found it relatively easy to resume their careers. Some took positions in West Germany's health bureaucracy. Others opened private practices. Their Nazi pasts became secrets they simply chose not to discuss. While some Nazi doctors resumed their lives in Germany, others followed a very different path, one that led not to punishment but to employment. In September 1945, the first group of German scientists arrived in the United States under a classified operation that would later be named Paperclip. The initial focus was rocket engineers who had developed the V-2 missile, but the program quickly expanded. American intelligence officers identified German specialists in aviation medicine, physiology, and other fields deemed valuable for Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. The scientists' Nazi affiliations were seen as an inconvenient detail rather than a disqualifying factor. Military officials argued that if America didn't recruit these men, the Soviets would. Among those brought to the United States was Hubertus Strughold, who had directed aviation medicine research for the Luftwaffe. Strughold had attended a 1942 conference where Nazi doctors discussed high-altitude and hypothermia experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. Whether he actively participated in those experiments remained disputed, but his knowledge of them was documented. Under Operation Paperclip, his Nazi Party membership was whitewashed from official records. He was brought to Texas, where he worked at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine and later contributed to NASA's space medicine program. He was eventually honored as the Father of Space Medicine, a title that ignored the human cost of the research that informed his expertise. It was only after his death in 1986 that historians and journalists began examining his wartime activities more closely. The recruitment of Nazi scientists created a moral paradox at the heart of American Cold War strategy. The same government that prosecuted doctors at Nuremberg simultaneously employed other Germans whose work had been enabled by the Nazi regime. The justification was utilitarian. The knowledge existed. The strategic advantage was real, and denying America that advantage wouldn't undo the past. But the policy meant that some men who had been part of the Nazi medical establishment transitioned seamlessly into respected positions in American institutions, their histories quietly erased. Not all Nazi doctors sought new lives in America or Germany. Some chose to flee. In the war's final days, as Allied armies closed in from east and west, high-ranking Nazis began planning escape routes. Networks known as rat lines emerged, smuggling war criminals out of Europe through Austria and Italy to ports where they could board ships for South America. The organizers included sympathetic Catholic clergy, fascist sympathizers, and opportunists who charged for their services. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, became the most welcoming destination. Perón actively recruited European fascists, viewing them as useful additions to Argentina's industrial and military capacity. He established secret channels that allowed thousands of Nazis to enter the country with minimal scrutiny. Josef Mengele arrived at the port of Buenos Aires on June 22, 1949, sailing under his own name with papers acquired through the German embassy. The Angel of Death, who had sent 400,000 people to the gas chambers and conducted grotesque experiments on twins at Auschwitz, lived openly in Argentina for several years. He obtained an Argentine foreign residence permit in 1956, operating a carpentry business and living without apparent fear of prosecution. West German authorities issued a warrant for his arrest in 1959, but by then Mengele had been tipped off. He fled to Paraguay, then to Brazil, where he moved between safe houses provided by expatriate German communities. Despite intensive manhunts by Israeli intelligence and Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, Mengele evaded capture. He died in 1979 when he suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach in São Paulo. His body was buried under a false name. It wasn't until 1985 that forensic investigators confirmed the remains were his. Mengele's case exemplified the frustrations of post-war justice. His crimes were documented in exhaustive detail. Survivors could identify him by sight. International authorities knew approximately where he was hiding. Yet he died of natural causes, never facing trial. The Nazi doctors who escaped shared certain advantages. They had often stolen substantial funds from their victims or drawn on Nazi assets hidden overseas. They found shelter in countries where anti-communist sentiment outweighed concerns about fascist pasts. And they benefited from Cold War priorities that focused intelligence resources elsewhere. The handful of doctors prosecuted at Nuremberg and the many who escaped or resumed their careers created a troubling accounting. Most Nazi doctors faced no consequences. Estimates suggest that hundreds of physicians participated in concentration camp experiments, euthanasia programs, or selections for the gas chambers. Only a small fraction ever stood trial. In West Germany, prosecutions were rare and often resulted in light sentences when they occurred at all. The German medical establishment was reluctant to confront its complicity. Medical schools avoided teaching about the Nazi period. Professional organizations resisted efforts to investigate members' wartime activities. The conspiracy of silence extended across institutions that preferred to look forward rather than back. Yet the doctor's trial had produced something beyond individual verdicts. In its judgment, the Nuremberg Tribunal articulated 10 principles for permissible medical research. The Nuremberg Code, as it became known, established that voluntary informed consent of human subjects was absolutely essential. It required that experiments must be necessary, that anticipated benefits must outweigh risks, and that subjects must have the freedom to withdraw. These principles were revolutionary. Before Nuremberg, no international standard governed medical research. Individual countries had varying regulations, and many had none at all. The Nazi experiments had revealed how easily medical science could become barbarism when ethics were subordinated to ideology. The Code's influence extended far beyond its immediate legal context. In the decades after 1947, it informed the development of research ethics worldwide. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, built on Nuremberg's foundation. National regulations requiring institutional review of human subjects research traced their origins to principles first articulated in response to Nazi crimes. Every informed consent form signed by a research participant today descends from the Nuremberg Code's first principle. The legacy was bitter. Universal standards for medical ethics emerged only after physicians had shown the world what happened when such standards didn't exist. The disparity in the doctors' fates exposed the limits of post-war justice. The men who faced trial at Nuremberg were held accountable because they were senior figures whose crimes were extensively documented and who remained in Allied custody. Systematic prosecution required evidence, resources, and political will. In the chaos of occupied Europe, with millions displaced, governments collapsed, and new conflicts emerging, comprehensive trials proved impossible. Many Nazi doctors simply waited out the initial wave of prosecutions, correctly calculating that urgency would fade as other priorities emerged. In Israel, the pursuit of Nazi criminals took on special meaning. The state established the Bureau for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, which methodically gathered evidence and tracked suspects. The most famous case was Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics, who was captured in Argentina in 1960 and tried in Jerusalem. But Israeli Nazi hunters also pursued doctors. They sought Mengele until the confirmation of his death. They provided evidence for German prosecutions of other medical criminals. The Israeli efforts kept pressure on perpetrators who thought they had escaped, though the results were mixed. Most doctors who reached South America lived out their lives undisturbed. The Eastern Bloc approached the question differently. Soviet authorities and East German communists emphasized Nazi medical crimes in their anti-fascist propaganda, but their prosecutions were often selective, targeting figures whose trials served political purposes while ignoring doctors who could be useful to socialist regimes. Both German states, East and West, harbored former Nazis who had become politically convenient. The denazification process, already compromised, largely ended by the early 1950s, as both sides of the Iron Curtain prioritized rebuilding over reckoning. By the 1960s, a new generation of Germans began demanding a fuller accounting. University students challenged professors about their wartime activities. Journalists investigated doctors practicing in German cities who had worked in concentration camps. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 prosecuted camp personnel, though few doctors faced charges. The trials marked a shift in German society's willingness to confront the past, but they also revealed how many perpetrators had lived comfortably for 2 decades since the war ended. Some doctors were stripped of their medical licenses decades after they had resumed practice. Others died before investigations concluded. The revelation that Nazi doctors had scattered across continents, some punished, some employed, and some comfortably hidden, created a historical puzzle about accountability. The post-war world struggled to balance justice against practical realities. Prosecuting every participant in Nazi medical crimes would have required resources that didn't exist and political commitment that wavered as Cold War tensions intensified. The result was a patchwork of justice. A few were hanged. Some went to prison. Many simply disappeared into new identities. And some were actively recruited by governments that valued their expertise more than their victims' suffering. The doctors' fates reflected broader patterns in how the post-war world dealt with Nazi criminals. High-profile leaders faced trial. Ordinary perpetrators often escaped. Specialists with valuable knowledge were sometimes protected. The moral calculus involved convenience, strategy, and the simple fact that the apparatus required to prosecute thousands of suspects across multiple countries didn't exist. Justice was selective not necessarily by design, but by the limitations of what was achievable in a broken world trying to rebuild. What happened to Nazi doctors after World War II was this. They met every possible fate. They were executed at Landsberg prison. They contributed to the space race. They practiced medicine in German towns under their own names. They died old and hidden in Brazilian beach towns. They were honored with awards and posthumously stripped of recognition. The range of outcomes revealed less about individual doctors' varying culpability and more about the fractured, inconsistent nature of post-war justice. The question wasn't simply what happened to them. It was why justice proved so elusive for so many who deserved it. The lasting impact of the doctor's trial and its aftermath extended into medical ethics, international law, and the understanding of how professionals can become perpetrators. The Nuremberg Code established principles that remain foundational 79 years later. Every medical school that teaches research ethics traces its curriculum to concepts first articulated in response to Nazi crimes. Every institutional review board that evaluates proposed studies applies standards born from Nuremberg. The doctor's crimes forced the world to recognize that medicine could become an instrument of evil when separated from ethical constraints, and that legal frameworks were necessary to prevent repetition. But the incomplete justice left uncomfortable questions. What did it mean that Hubertus Strughold's name was on buildings and awards for decades before his Nazi connections led to their removal? What did it mean that Josef Mengele lived comfortably in South America while his victims' families waited for justice that never came? What did it mean that hundreds of doctors who participated in concentration camp medicine simply resumed their careers? The fates of Nazi doctors revealed that the post-war order delivered accountability selectively, shaped by Cold War priorities, limited resources, and the simple passage of time that made prosecution increasingly difficult. The survivors of Nazi medical experiments lived with the consequences, while their tormentors often did not. Some survivors dedicated their lives to ensuring the crimes were remembered. They testified at trials decades after the war. They shared their stories with researchers and educators. They bore witness so the world would know what had been done to them. Their insistence on memory created a legacy that outlasted the doctors themselves. The ethical frameworks born from Nuremberg, the historical documentation of the crimes, and the determination to teach future generations represented a different kind of justice, one that operated on a longer timeline than criminal trials. When the last Nazi doctor died of old age in a comfortable bed, the question of justice remained unresolved. The world had established principles. It had prosecuted some perpetrators. It had documented the crimes in exhaustive detail. But most doctors who turned medicine into torture faced no punishment. They lived long lives, raised families, and died without acknowledging what they had done. The gap between crime and consequence stands as one of World War II's enduring moral failures. The doctors' fates remind us that accountability is not inevitable, that justice requires sustained effort, and that without institutional commitment to prosecution, even documented atrocities can go unpunished. The Nazi doctors who survived the war dispersed across the globe, carrying secrets, skills, and in some cases data derived from suffering. Some faced the consequences their crimes deserved. Many did not. Their varied fates map the limits of post-war justice and the priorities of a world that chose strategic advantage over moral clarity when it suited convenience. The legacy they left was contradictory, foundational principles in medical ethics alongside a cautionary tale about how easily accountability can be sacrificed to other interests. What happened to Nazi doctors after the war was not one story, but many. And the pattern they formed revealed as much about the world that tried them, employed them, or ignored them as it did about the doctors themselves. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.